Generous federal land grants and subsidies pushed the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. When finished, it opened the Great Plains and connected the Pacific to the Atlantic and Gulf ports, spurring rapid global exchange. In 1869, the driving of the Golden Spike linking the last rail from east to west ended the first phase of Western Railroad development. Between 1869 and 1900, regional railroad entrepreneurs like the so-called Empire Builder, James J. Hill, stepped in when the robber barons of the Transcontinental epoch moved on to greener pastures. A Canadian, Hill migrated to St. Paul, Minnesota, and saw opportunity for transportation development across the northern borderlands. Hill first linked the expansive Canadian prairie with the Great Plains and distant markets with lines between St. Paul and Winnipeg, Canada. Throughout the 1880s, Hill connected the Great Northern Railway lines east to Chicago, and finally in 1893, west to Seattle and the Pacific. Regional rail development in the 1880s and 1890s used 25% of U.S. annual timber production and spawned the massive or bonanza wheat farms of the Dakotas and the fruit and vegetable economies of Arizona and California. Western coal mining grew from regional rail demands for cheaper energy. A combination of federal land grants and savvy land deals with boosters and politicians gave the railroads massive checkerboard tracts of land to sell to cash-poor migrants. Although land was cheap, transportation costs weren't. Farmers and ranchers who bought land from the railroads or acquired homesteads depended on the railroad for access to the world markets that dictated the values of their crops and animals. The railroads even set the farmers' clocks when they established time zones in the 1880s. The large distances traversed by U.S. and Canadian railroads especially necessitated a closely regulated system of time to replace the confusion of the solar time that shaped the lives of humans for millennia. Railroad land grants continue to this day to shape life and economies in the West, where companies like the Southern Pacific maintain large land holdings and control critical transportation corridors. During the heyday of the 1880s, rail competition drove down transportation costs in most parts of the West. Farmers both benefited and suffered from greater access to national and international markets facilitated by powerful railroad corporations. Through lean times, farmers borrowed heavily to finance future crops and pay shipping. When the fickle environment cooperated, farmers used new technologies like the McCormick harvesting machine to produce massive yields that drove down prices of staples like wheat. Unlike industrial capitalists, individual farmers rarely benefited from economies of scale. The harder they worked, the more efficient they were, the less they profited. The populist movement rose from the ashes of the arid conditions of the 1890s when farm economies collapsed. Geographically dispersed farmers seeking collective organization faced significant challenges. They united first through social organizations like the Grange and then political alliances that linked South and West. Encouraged by fiery leaders like Mary Elizabeth Lease to raise less corn and more hay, farmers formalized their populist party at an 1892 convention in Omaha, Nebraska. The Omaha platform advocated socialization of the nation's railroads and other far-sighted reforms aimed at empowering family farmers in the industrial age. In the long run, agribusiness, industrial ranching, and federal subsidies provided the only consistently successful method for reaping the riches of the plains. In the 1880s and 1890s, military action and federal legislation in tandem with cultural and economic forces erased established Indian territorial lines drawn under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, and thus drastically reduced the amount of Indian-controlled land and isolated them against their will on small, scattered reservations. The visible boundaries of Indian lands could still be mapped in the late 1870s, but they remained contested regions. The lines on maps only provided an illusion of geographic organization during a time of shifting borders, tribal movements and alliances, and, of course, disastrous government policies. Indian commissioners and leaders of various Christian denominations provided Indians with food and clothing in exchange for promises to abandon cultural traditions and to assimilate into American society. Simultaneously, Indians were pushed, often under direct military threat, to move to increasingly smaller reservations on land considered unsuitable for migrant settlement or industry. By the late 1880s, the U.S. government acknowledged that the only Indian territory left was that on rapidly shrinking reservations. At the same time, and with strong public support, the U.S. military waged constant war with the same people the Indian commissioners and the U.S. Department of the Interior were trying to assimilate.